the fantasy genre, fantasy tropes themselves can actually be used to tell a literary story. Isn't that crazy? Because a lot of the time people will say, oh, the fantasy genre is not capable of literary sort of height in terms of like how deep, emotional and thematic of a story fantasy writers can tell using the fantasy genre. Well, a lot of the time they claim, especially from snobs, is that, hey, guess what? You cannot do that with the fantasy genre. But N.K. Jemisin actually proves all of them wrong. And the reason why she does this, it might sound contrary. She uses fantasy tropes in order to tell a literary fantasy story. And this is one of the reasons why I really love the fantasy genre. In fact, one of the reasons why I started writing in the fantasy genre. And hey, if you are a young writer right now, if you are a young aspiring writer, do not be turned off from the fantasy genre because you don't think that there is any sort of literary acclaim from that fantasy genre, right? In other words, don't let the snobs get to you and scare you from your favorite genre. I am being completely honest when I say this. You can write whatever you want in the fantasy genre. If you want literary, you can get literary. If you want thriller, you can get thriller. If you want mystery, you can have mystery. You can have romance. You can have anything. And N.K. Jemisin proves that the highest criticism lauded and tossed at the fantasy genre is actually quite a false and terrible critique because it doesn't hold true under the most minimal scrutiny. Let's actually take our first book, Broken Earth, the first book in that trilogy in the 5th season. We follow this character called Damaya, and throughout the story, Damaya suffers with grief. She suffers with, revenge. The characters that she loses, the people that she loses, the loved ones that she loses, well, those people have magic, and magic is looked down upon. How generic is this? Like in the fantasy genre, I want to ask you, even in YA, in young adult fantasy, like how generic is it that the protagonist will have some sort of a magical mutation, and then people look down upon them because of that mutation? This is what is happening here. And Damaya is looked down upon throughout the story and is discriminated against because of her magical abilities. But you see what is happening here? N.K. Jemisin uses fantasy tropes in order to actually tell a very good, literary story, technically a masterpiece. So that's the first lesson, which is that N.K. Jemisin uses tropes to tell a good story. But the second thing is that actually N.K. Jemisin is not a stereotypical author. In other words, she does not really use a lot of tropes. Isn't that crazy? Like it is very, very contradictory and it is very hypocritical. But actually, oftentimes when people talk about tropes, I'm talking about cheap, overused tropes, and doing those cheap, overused tropes in the same way that everyone else has done them before. And predictable tropes is specifically what I'm talking about. Because you see, while N.K. Jemisin uses tropes in order to tell literary stories, that is not a trope, because you see, that is not done often. In other words, trope is something that is stereotypical for a genre. Using tropes of the fantasy genre to tell a literary story is not stereotypical. In fact, it is quite rare. Do not use tropes predictably. In other words, for instance, I hate it when a lot of people retread and they walk the same path everyone has walked before. So they're going to have this particular protagonist. This protagonist is going to be deep down, they're special, they don't know it, or they might know it and, someone comes to tell them and then, suddenly they skyrocket in the social hierarchy. Everyone wants them. All the beautiful women want them. Oftentimes they're a boy. Yes. And the list just goes on. There's a lot of these predictable fantasy plot beats, and a lot of people retread and they walk the same path a lot of people have walked before with just a different magic object. In other words, this story is not actually looking after that magical object. It's going after this other magical object, which does a completely different thing. Therefore, it's a unique story. It's a unique tale in the fantasy genre. But I want to actually specifically state that using tropes predictably makes your story boring. And I love that N.K. Jemisin does not do this. And in fact, I have learned this from N.K. Jemisin. You don't have to. You don't need to. In fact, with how the 5th season is structured, the first book in the Broken Earth trilogy, oh my God, your mind is going to be blown by the end of it, because and when the reveal happens toward the end of that book, well, guess what? It all just starts to make sense. It all just, it's a beautiful masterpiece. No wonder it's won a Hugo Award. And so that is the two things I have learned from N.K. Jemisin. They might sound contradictory, but they are not. They might sound contradictory, but they are not. In fact, these two things sort of come together and they help each other out, because she's using tropes unpredictably. And she's using tropes to tell a literary story. And so that is what I've learned from N.K. Jemisin. You can use fantasy's basic tropes to tell any type of story you want, and then you can take those tropes and spin them in a new way, and you will still be able to tell a new, fresh take on what was common and stereotypical. I hope that you enjoyed this. I do daily upload, so you can consider subscribing. Have a nice day.